The smell of salt spray and aviation fuel mingled in the frigid December air as Admiral Yamamoto lifted his brush to write 4 characters that would ignite the Pacific. Niitakayama Nobor, climb Mount Niitaka. The fate of nations has always hinged on single moments of decision, encrypted messages sent across vast oceans, and the courage of men who must execute plans that will either secure their homeland's future or condemn it to destruction. What happened in the final days of 1941 would determine whether Japan could seize the resources it desperately needed to survive, or whether it would awaken an industrial giant that would crush the rising sun beneath waves of steel and fire. On the morning of December 2nd, 1941, Yamamoto's coded telegram raced through naval communications networks from his flagship, anchored in Hashirajima Bay. The poetic reference to Taiwan's highest peak carried a meaning known only to a select few. Operation Z was a go. The date embedded in the message, 1208, told Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai exactly when to strike. 300 miles to the north, aboard the carrier Akagi, the telegram's arrival sent a shiver of anticipation through the ship's steel corridors. Many of the carrier crews had suspected their true destination during the weeks of intensive training, but confirmation still hit like a physical blow. They were sailing to attack Pearl Harbor, the heart of American naval power in the Pacific. The genesis of this moment stretched back 18 months to Yamamoto's oil calculations. After President Roosevelt's embargo in July 1941, Japan's reserves would sustain the empire for perhaps 18 months. Without the petroleum of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya, and the tin of Burma, Japan faced industrial strangulation. But seizing these southern resources would mean war with Britain, the Netherlands, and inevitably the United States. The only way to buy time for conquest was to cripple the American Pacific Fleet at its moorings. Yamamoto had pushed this plan through months of resistance from traditionalists who favored battleship engagements closer to home waters. The combined fleet commander understood what many of his colleagues refused to accept. Japan's window of opportunity was measured in months, not years. Every day of delay allowed American industrial capacity to grow stronger, while Japan's oil reserves dwindled. In the ready rooms of 6 aircraft carriers now cutting through the North Pacific's grey swells, pilots pored over target photographs and harbour charts provided by their most valuable intelligence asset. Naval spy Takeo Yoshikawa, operating undercover as consulate clerk Tadashi Morimura, had spent months cataloguing ship movements, defensive positions, and harbour depths from his perch in Honolulu. His microfilmed reports, hidden in weather broadcasts and diplomatic pouches, painted a detailed picture of Pearl Harbor's vulnerabilities. The technical challenges had seemed insurmountable just months earlier. Pearl Harbor's shallow 12 to 15-meter depths would cause standard aerial torpedoes to dive too deep, burying themselves in harbor mud rather than striking ship hulls. Japanese engineers solved this by crafting wooden tail assemblies that would break away on water impact, allowing the Type 91 torpedoes to run at precisely the right depth. Meanwhile, armor-piercing bombs were being fashioned from 16-inch naval gun shells, creating 800-kilogram monsters capable of punching through the thickest battleship armor. As Kido Butai maintained radio silence and threaded its way through the storm-lashed northern route, the enormity of their mission settled over the fleet like morning fog. 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, carried the cream of Japan's naval aviation. 2 fast battleships, 3 cruisers, and 9 destroyers provided escort. Never before had such concentrated naval aviation power been assembled for a single strike. Below decks, maintenance crews worked by red-filtered light to preserve night vision, hand-checking every bolt and wire on the 353 aircraft that would launch in 2 waves. The acrid smell of dope and lubricants mixed with the ever-present odor of vomit as sailors fought seasickness in the heavy seas. Sleep came fitfully in the hammocks stacked 3 high in the crew quarters, each man knowing that in 5 days they would either return as heroes or join their ancestors in the depths of the Pacific. Could you imagine the weight of carrying such a secret, knowing that your next mission might reshape the balance of global power? The pieces were moving into position across the Pacific chessboard, but the most critical questions remained unanswered. Where were the American aircraft carriers? Would the surprise be complete? And perhaps most importantly, would a single devastating blow be enough to keep the sleeping giant from awakening? If you found yourself transported back to that moment, listening to the wind howl through Akagi's rigging as she ploughed through the dark waters toward her date with history, would you have had the nerve to execute such an audacious plan? Let me know in the comments, and if this glimpse into Japan's perspective on Pearl Harbor intrigued you, please consider subscribing for more untold stories from the Pacific War. I'm recording this on a cold December evening here in Los Angeles, exactly 83 years after Yamamoto sent his fateful message. But even as the carriers pressed eastward through the storm-tossed seas, final preparations were being made that would determine whether Operation Z would achieve the decisive victory Japan desperately needed, or merely serve as the opening act in a much longer and bloodier conflict. The ice-crusted spray hammered Akagi's flight deck as dawn broke over the most desolate stretch of the North Pacific, each wave sending shudders through 600 feet of steel that housed Japan's most carefully guarded secret. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge, watching his deck crews chip ice from aircraft wings with the methodical precision of men who understood that a single oversight could doom the entire operation. The Kido Butai had been threading through these frigid waters for 11 days, following a route so remote that lookouts reported seeing fewer ships than fingers on one hand. This isolation was both blessing and curse. While it preserved the element of surprise, it also meant that if something went catastrophically wrong, help lay thousands of miles away. The carriers had departed Hitokapu Bay in the Kurils on November 26th, their hulls heavy with enough aviation fuel, bombs, and torpedoes to level a city. The northern route had been chosen precisely because merchant shipping avoided these storm-lashed waters, but the price was constant battle against nature itself. Waves towered 30 feet above the carrier's flight decks, and the temperature rarely climbed above freezing. Sailors worked in shifts to prevent frostbite, their breath forming ice crystals that clung to bulkheads and equipment. Below decks, the atmosphere was thick with tension and the smell of grease, sweat, and fear. In the ready rooms, pilots studied their target folders until they could navigate Pearl Harbor's channels blindfolded. Commander Fuchida, who would lead the first wave, had memorized every detail of Ford Island's layout, every bearing from landmark to target. His pilots knew the silhouettes of American battleships, as well as they knew their own mothers' faces. The modified Type 91 torpedoes posed the greatest technical challenge. Standard aerial torpedoes dropped from 200 feet would dive to depths of 60 feet or more before leveling off, useless in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. Japanese engineers had crafted wooden tail assemblies and anti-roll devices that would detach upon water entry, allowing the torpedoes to run at exactly 10 to 12 meters depth. Test after test at Kagoshima Bay had proven the concept, but combat conditions would provide the ultimate validation. Meanwhile, the armor-piercing bombs represented a triumph of improvisation. 16-inch naval shells had been converted into 800-kilogram aerial weapons, their fuses carefully calibrated to penetrate battleship armor before detonating. These monsters could punch through multiple steel decks and explode deep within a ship's vitals, if they worked as designed. The human cost of this isolation was becoming apparent. Seasickness ravaged the fleet, leaving many sailors barely functional. The constant rolling motion made sleeping difficult, eating a challenge, and routine maintenance hazardous. Several men had been injured by loose equipment during particularly violent storms. Yet morale remained surprisingly high, sustained by a mixture of duty, pride, and the intoxicating possibility of achieving something unprecedented in naval history. On December 1st, while Kido Butai battled through another Pacific gale, the Imperial Conference in Tokyo formally approved war against the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. Emperor Hirohito had asked detailed questions about oil supplies and military prospects before giving his sanction. The die was cast, but the fleet steaming toward Hawaii remained unaware that the final political decision had been made. Radio silence was absolute. The carrier's powerful transmitters sat cold and silent, their operators maintaining watch schedules but forbidden to send even routine weather reports. Back in Japan, decoy transmitters mimicked normal fleet communications, broadcasting the routine chatter that would suggest the combined fleet remained in home waters. This deception was crucial. American intelligence monitored Japanese naval communications constantly, and any sign that major fleet units had disappeared would trigger alerts across the Pacific. The strain of maintaining operational security was enormous. Letters home had been censored weeks before departure, with ship names and destinations carefully excised. Many wives and families learned of their loved ones' participation only after the attack, when carefully worded news reports hinted at which units had participated in the glorious victory. But perhaps the most challenging aspect was the uncertainty that gnawed at every level of command. Intelligence reports suggested that American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were frequently absent from Pearl Harbor, conducting training exercises or ferrying aircraft to outlying bases. If these carriers were at sea during the attack, they would remain as potent threats to Japanese operations in the Central Pacific. Worse, they might launch immediate counterstrikes against the Japanese fleet while it was still within range. The 5 Ko-Hyoteki midget submarines added another layer of complexity to the operation. These two-man craft had been launched from mother submarines and were attempting to infiltrate Pearl Harbor itself, timing their arrival to coincide with the air attack. The plan called for them to create additional chaos and confusion, striking targets of opportunity while American attention was focused skyward. Navigation in these waters tested every skill the fleet possessed. Dead reckoning and celestial navigation were the only options, with radio beacons and landmarks thousands of miles away. A navigation error of even a few degrees could place the fleet hundreds of miles off course, potentially missing the launch window entirely. The navigators worked in shifts, cross-checking calculations, and praying that the weather would clear enough for star sights when they needed them most. As the fleet pressed eastward, the psychological pressure mounted. These were not green recruits, but experienced naval aviators, many with combat experience over China. Yet the magnitude of what they were attempting, striking the most powerful naval base in the Pacific while it slept, was unprecedented. Success would require not just skill and courage, but luck on a scale that defied calculation. Picture yourself in that freezing ready room, studying photographs of ships you would have to find and attack in just hours, knowing that the entire future of your nation depended on your accuracy under fire. Unknown to the Japanese airmen reviewing their attack plans, American cryptographers had been reading portions of their diplomatic codes for months, but the crucial details of Operation Z remained hidden beneath layers of naval cipher and operational security that would hold until the first bombs fell on Battleship Row. At 6:37 on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the destroyer USS Ward's 3-inch gun cracked like thunder across Pearl Harbor's entrance channel, firing America's first shots of the Pacific War at a steel shark that had no right to be there. This moment should have changed everything, should have sent alarm bells screaming across every military installation on Oahu, should have scrambled fighters and manned every gun battery from Diamond Head to the North Shore. Instead, the warning died in a tangle of bureaucratic confusion and peacetime complacency, leaving Pearl Harbor as defenseless as a sleeping child when the storm broke 2 hours later. The Ko-Hyoteki midget submarine that Ward engaged was one of 5 two-man craft launched from mother submarines lurking beyond the harbor's approaches. Each midget sub carried 2 torpedoes and a crew trained to die for the Emperor if necessary. Their mission was to slip through the harbor's defenses under cover of darkness and strike American capital ships from within the anchorage itself, coordinating their attacks with the incoming airstrike. But mechanical failures and navigational errors had scattered the tiny submarines across the approaches to Pearl Harbor. One had run aground on a reef, its crew struggling unsuccessfully to refloat their craft as dawn approached. Another had been spotted by Ward's lookouts, its conning tower cutting a white wake through the calm waters as it attempted to follow the target ship Antares through the harbor's submarine nets. Ward's commanding officer, Lieutenant William Outerbridge, had been awakened by his officer of the deck with a report that defied easy categorization. A submarine contact near the harbor entrance might be American, but no American submarines were scheduled to transit the area. It might be a false alarm. Whale shadows and floating debris often triggered submarine reports. But if it was real, and if it was Japanese, then war had already begun whether Washington knew it or not. The 4-inch gun mount trained around with mechanical precision as Ward closed the range to less than 50 yards. At point-blank range, the destroyer's gunners could hardly miss. The shell punched through the midget submarine's thin hull and exploded, sending the craft to the bottom in a geyser of white water and twisted steel. One of Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki's fellow submariners had just become the first Japanese casualty of the Pacific War, 2 hours before anyone expected the shooting to start. Ward's radio crackled with urgent traffic as Outerbridge reported the engagement to the 14th Naval District Headquarters. "We have dropped depth charges upon subs operating in defensive sea area," his message read. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges on submarine operating in defensive sea area." The language was careful, professional, and utterly clear in its implications. Yet the warning system that should have responded with lightning speed instead ground through layers of verification and interpretation that consumed precious minutes. Shore-based commanders debated whether the contact was real, whether Ward had actually engaged an enemy submarine, whether the situation warranted a full alert. Peacetime procedures demanded confirmation before taking actions that might embarrass senior officers or disrupt weekend routines. Meanwhile, at Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, and Ford Island, hundreds of American aircraft sat parked in neat rows, their engines cold and their fuel tanks topped off. The peacetime arrangement was designed to prevent sabotage. Concentrating aircraft made them easier to guard against potential infiltrators from Oahu's large Japanese-American population. That this same arrangement would make them perfect targets for air attack seemed to have occurred to no one in positions of authority. The radar station at Opana Point had been tracking what appeared to be a large flight of aircraft approaching from the north since 7 o'clock that morning. The two young Army privates manning the experimental radar set watched the blips grow stronger and more numerous as they approached Oahu. When Private Joseph Lockhart called the information center to report the contact, he was told by a duty officer to forget it. A flight of B-17 bombers was expected from California, and this was probably them. In fact, 12 flying fortresses were approaching Oahu from the northeast, their crews looking forward to breakfast and clean sheets after the long flight from Hamilton Field. What the radar operators were seeing was something far more dangerous. 183 Japanese aircraft in the first wave, approaching Pearl Harbor at altitudes calculated to avoid early detection while maintaining formation integrity. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led this aerial armada from the cockpit of a Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber, his aircraft loaded with one of the specially modified armor-piercing bombs designed to penetrate battleship decks. Behind him flew 40 torpedo bombers, 49 high-level bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 Zero fighters. Each pilot had memorized his targets, his approach route, and his escape path. Each had written final letters home and made peace with the possibility that this morning might be his last. The smell of aviation fuel and hot engine oil filled the cockpits as the formation descended toward their attack altitude. Pilots adjusted their oxygen masks and checked their weapon systems one final time. Bombardiers armed their loads and peered through their sights at the peaceful island, growing larger beneath them. Fighter pilots tested their guns with short bursts, the brass cartridges tumbling away into the blue Pacific far below. At 7:49, Fuchida keyed his radio and transmitted the code words that would echo through history. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The message confirmed what Japanese planners had barely dared hope. Complete tactical surprise had been achieved. The American Pacific Fleet lay spread before them like pieces on a game board, unaware that the game had already begun. The first bombs fell on Ford Island at 7:55, sending geysers of dirt and debris skyward as Japanese dive bombers screamed down on the Naval Air Station's neat rows of parked aircraft. The sound was unlike anything the Americans had experienced, a rising shriek that seemed to tear the very air apart, followed by explosions that shook buildings and shattered windows across the harbor. Think of that moment when the impossible becomes real, when the peaceful morning you expected transforms into something from your darkest nightmares. But the most devastating attacks were yet to come, as torpedo bombers swept in at masthead height toward the sitting ducks of Battleship Row, their specially modified weapons armed and ready to gut the American battle line where it lay at anchor. The sound of 40 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers dropping to attack altitude was like distant thunder rolling across Pearl Harbor's mirror-calm waters, but by the time anyone looked up to identify the source, death was already screaming toward Battleship Row at 180 knots. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata led the torpedo attack from the cockpit of his Kate, skimming barely 10 meters above the harbor's surface as oil-black water flashed beneath his wings. Behind him, his squadron had split into two parallel attack formations, designed to bracket the American battleships with crossing torpedo tracks that would overwhelm any defensive fire. The months of training at Kagoshima Bay, perfecting shallow-water torpedo drops over measured ranges, now crystallized into 30 seconds of pure precision flying. The first torpedoes struck USS Oklahoma at 7:56, their 800-pound warheads exploding against the battleship's port side in rapid succession. The massive vessel shuddered as if struck by a giant's hammer, her hull plates buckling inward as thousands of tons of seawater rushed through the gaping wounds. Within minutes, Oklahoma began her death roll, trapping hundreds of sailors in compartments that became steel coffins as the ship capsized. USS West Virginia absorbed even more punishment, taking at least 6 torpedoes along her port side as Japanese pilots pressed their attacks to point-blank range. The battleship's armor belt, designed to withstand naval gunfire, proved inadequate against weapons delivered from directly abeam at waterline level. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the ship's structure, buckling bulkheads and fracturing steam lines that filled compartments with superheated vapor. But the most devastating single blow fell on USS Arizona at 8:06, when a modified 16-inch shell, dropped from 10,000 feet by a high-level bomber, punched through the battleship's forward deck and detonated in her forward magazine. The explosion was visible 20 miles away, a crimson fireball that lifted Arizona's forward superstructure into the air before dropping it back as twisted wreckage. The shockwave shattered windows across Pearl Harbor and was felt as far away as Honolulu. Japanese pilots circling at altitude watched in fascination and horror as the magazine explosion created what one described as a red-orange blossom licking the sky. The blast killed over 1,000 men. Instantly, more Americans than would die in any other single moment of the Pacific War. Arizona's burning hulk settled to the harbor bottom, her superstructure still visible above water, but transformed from a symbol of American naval power into a funeral pyre. The coordinated nature of the attack became apparent as dive bombers screamed down on the airfields while torpedo planes gutted the battle line. At Wheeler Field, Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers targeted the neat rows of P-40 Warhawks and P-36 fighters parked wingtip to wingtip for security against sabotage. The peacetime arrangement that was supposed to protect American aircraft instead made them perfect targets for destruction. Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters swept in at treetop level, their wing-mounted machine guns stitching lines of destruction across the flight line. One pilot later described the American fighters as looking like paper-thin tents erupting like dry leaves under the impact of 7.7mm rounds. Fuel tanks exploded, ammunition cooked off in chains of secondary explosions, and aircraft that had cost millions of dollars to build were reduced to smoking scrap in minutes. The human cost was mounting as rapidly as the material destruction. At Hickam Field, mechanics and ground crews who had been performing routine Sunday morning maintenance found themselves trapped in the open as Japanese fighters strafed everything that moved. Some tried to run for the hangars, only to discover that the large buildings drew concentrated attack from dive bombers. Others attempted to fight back with rifles and pistols, their small arms fire hopelessly inadequate against armored aircraft. At Ford Island, the Naval Air Station's complement of patrol bombers presented tempting targets for Japanese pilots tasked with eliminating American reconnaissance capability. The large, slow, consolidated PBY Catalinas were particularly vulnerable, their high-wing design and fabric control surfaces offering little protection against incendiary rounds. Within minutes, the squadron that was supposed to search thousands of square miles of Pacific Ocean for approaching threats had been reduced to burning hulks. The second wave of Japanese aircraft, 170 planes led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, arrived over Pearl Harbor at 8:40 to find a harbor transformed by smoke, fire, and desperate defensive measures. American gunners had found their rhythm, filling the sky with black bursts of anti-aircraft fire that forced Japanese pilots to climb higher and attack from less favorable angles. The smoke and flames rising from Battleship Row created thermal updrafts that buffeted low-flying aircraft and made precision bombing more difficult. Several Japanese pilots reported being bounced around like leaves in a hurricane as they tried to line up on targets partially obscured by the pall of destruction from the first wave. Yet they pressed their attacks with the same methodical precision that had characterized the opening assault. USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a magnet for Japanese attention as she attempted to sortie from the harbor. Dive bombers concentrated on the moving target, scoring several hits that started fires and caused flooding. Rather than risk having Nevada sink in the harbor channel and block the entrance, American officers deliberately grounded her on Hospital Point, where she settled by the bow but remained afloat. The oil fires spreading across the harbor created a hellscape that defied description. Bunker fuel from ruptured battleships formed a black slick that ignited into walls of flame reaching hundreds of feet into the air. Men who had been blown into the water found themselves swimming through liquid fire, their clothes and hair catching flame as they struggled toward shore. The smell of burning oil, cordite, and worse things filled the air with a stench that would linger for days. Can you imagine the terror of being trapped aboard a capsizing battleship, feeling the deck tilting beneath your feet as thousands of tons of steel prepared to become your tomb? As the second wave completed its attacks and turned north toward the waiting carriers, Pearl Harbor lay wreathed in smoke and flame, its once proud battle line reduced to smoking hulks and its airfields littered with the wreckage of American air power. but the most crucial targets remained untouched, an oversight that would prove fatal to Japanese hopes. The acrid smoke of burning aviation fuel stung Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's eyes as he circled above Pearl Harbor at 10,000 feet, counting the devastation his airmen had wrought while searching desperately for the targets that weren't there. Where American aircraft carriers should have been moored, where intelligence officer Takeo Yoshikawa's careful surveillance had suggested they might be found, empty berths mocked the Japanese strike commander's hopes. Enterprise was ferrying marine fighters to Wake Island. Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway. Saratoga sat in dry dock on the west coast undergoing maintenance. The three most valuable targets in the Pacific Fleet had escaped the net through nothing more than routine scheduling and dumb luck. This absence would haunt Japanese strategic thinking for the remainder of the war, but in the immediate aftermath of the attack, it posed a more pressing tactical dilemma. Fuchida's aircraft were recovering aboard their carriers, his pilots euphoric from the apparent success of their mission. Yet Vice Admiral Nagumo faced a decision that would determine whether Pearl Harbor marked the beginning of Japanese victory or merely the opening act of a much longer struggle. At 10:30 that morning, as the last Japanese aircraft cleared Hawaiian airspace, Nagumo's staff gathered in Akagi's flag plot to debate launching a third wave. Air Officer Minoru Genda argued passionately for immediate re-attack. The fuel tank farms on Oahu held 4.5 million barrels of oil, enough to sustain American operations for months. The submarine base had been barely touched, leaving intact a facility that could support devastating attacks on Japanese shipping. Most critically, the dry docks and repair facilities that could restore damaged battleships remained operational. The arguments for withdrawal were equally compelling. Staff Chief Ryunosuke Kusaka pointed out that American anti-aircraft fire had grown increasingly accurate during the second wave, shooting down 15 aircraft compared to only 9 in the first attack. More importantly, the location of American carriers remained unknown. They could be anywhere within a 500-mile radius, potentially positioning themselves for a counterattack while Japanese aircraft were tied down over Pearl Harbor. The fuel situation added another layer of complexity. Kido Butai's destroyers were approaching their operational limits, having consumed enormous quantities of fuel fighting through the North Pacific storms. The fleet oilers had rendezvoused multiple times during the approach, transferring thousands of tons of fuel oil in heavy seas that slopped gasoline across steel decks and threatened catastrophic fires. Another day of high-speed operations might leave the destroyers too short of fuel to reach their planned refueling point. Nagumo himself remained torn between the competing imperatives. A gunnery officer by training and temperament, he understood the value of consolidating gains rather than risking everything on extended operations. His primary mission had been to neutralize American naval power for 6 months, while Japan seized the southern resources area. By that measure, the attack had succeeded beyond all expectations. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, nearly 400 aircraft destroyed, and American offensive capability crippled. Yet the missing carriers represented an incalculable threat. Even one American flat-top with a full air group could devastate Japanese invasion fleets or strike the home islands themselves. The Doolittle raid was still 4 months in the future, but the strategic logic that would make it possible was already apparent to anyone who understood carrier warfare. The human cost of indecision was mounting by the hour. In Pearl Harbor's oil-slicked waters, rescue crews worked frantically to cut through the overturned hull of USS Oklahoma, following the sound of trapped sailors tapping SOS messages on the ship's interior bulkheads. Similar rescue efforts were underway throughout the harbor, as divers and cutting crews raced against time to reach men imprisoned in flooded compartments. Aboard USS Arizona, fires continued to rage despite desperate firefighting efforts. The forward magazines had been completely destroyed, but secondary fires threatened to spread to the after magazines and create an even larger explosion. Damage control parties worked in temperatures that melted their shoes, breathing air so superheated it seared their lungs, driven by the knowledge that hundreds of their shipmates remained trapped below decks. The psychological impact extended far beyond Pearl Harbor itself. Radio intercepts suggested that American morale had not collapsed as Japanese planners had hoped. Instead, recruitment offices across the mainland were reporting lines of volunteers that stretched around city blocks. Congress would vote for war with only one dissenting voice, transforming American isolationism into unified determination for revenge. Meanwhile, Japanese diplomats in Washington were discovering the diplomatic cost of the attack's timing. The 14-part message that was supposed to break off negotiations before hostilities began had been delayed by encoding difficulties and embassy inefficiency. It was delivered more than an hour after the first bombs fell, making the attack appear treacherous even by the standards of total war. This diplomatic failure would prove more damaging than any military consideration. The date which will live in infamy speech that President Roosevelt would deliver to Congress drew much of its emotional power from the perception that Japan had attacked without warning while peace negotiations were still underway. The image of Japanese diplomats smiling and shaking hands in Washington while their navy was launching a surprise attack became a powerful propaganda tool that would sustain American war effort through 4 years of bitter fighting. At 11:45, Nagumo made his decision. Kido Butai would withdraw to the northwest, recover its aircraft, and clear Hawaiian waters before American forces could organize effective retaliation. The fuel farms, submarine base, and repair facilities would remain intact, an oversight that would enable American recovery far more rapidly than Japanese planners deemed possible. Picture yourself in Nagumo's position, weighing incomplete intelligence against operational risks, knowing that your next decision might determine your nation's fate for generations to come. But even as the Japanese carriers turned away from their greatest tactical victory, events were already in motion that would transform Pearl Harbor from an ending into a beginning, the first move in a chess game that would consume the Pacific for the next 44 months. The taste of oil and smoke clung to Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata's throat as he guided his Kate bomber back toward the Akagi, the euphoria of successful torpedo runs already giving way to the sobering arithmetic of what they had accomplished and what they had failed to destroy. Behind him, Pearl Harbor burned like a vision of hell brought to earth, its waters black with fuel oil that fed towering pillars of flame and smoke visible 50 miles away. Yet as Murata's aircraft joined the recovery pattern around the Japanese carriers, a different kind of fire was spreading, one that would ultimately prove far more dangerous to the rising sun than any American battleship. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt was already crafting the speech that would transform American isolationism into righteous fury. The diplomatic failure of the 14-part message had handed him a propaganda victory beyond his wildest dreams. Japan had not merely attacked American territory, they had done so while their diplomats smiled and shook hands in the very corridors where war was being declared. The date which will live in infamy was being born in the gap between diplomatic protocol and military action. Across the American mainland, the initial shock was crystallizing into something far more dangerous to Japanese hopes than military despair. In recruitment offices from Boston to San Francisco, lines of volunteers stretched around city blocks. Young men who had spent Saturday night arguing about whether America should enter the European war were now demanding immediate assignment to the Pacific. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared awakening was stirring with a vengeance that would reshape the global balance of power. But the most immediate reckoning was taking place in the smoke-filled waters of Pearl Harbor itself. Rescue crews worked with desperate efficiency to reach sailors trapped in the overturned hull of USS Oklahoma, following the rhythmic tapping of SOS signals that grew weaker with each passing hour. 32 men would be cut free from the capsized battleship over the next 2 days, but for every dramatic rescue, dozens more remained entombed in steel compartments that had become underwater graves. The human stories emerging from the chaos revealed both the horror and heroism that would characterize the Pacific War. Doris Miller, a mess attendant aboard USS West Virginia, had carried wounded sailors to safety before manning an anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he had never been trained to operate because Navy regulations restricted black sailors to support roles. His actions would eventually earn him the Navy Cross, but on December 7th, he was simply one of hundreds of men doing whatever they could to save their ships and shipmates. The material damage assessment painted a picture of tactical success that masked strategic failure. 8 American battleships had been sunk or severely damaged, along with 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers. Nearly 400 aircraft had been destroyed or damaged, most caught on the ground in neat peacetime formations. By any conventional measure, the attack had achieved its primary objectives, yet the targets that remained untouched would prove more significant than those destroyed. The 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil in the tank farms represented months of operational capability for the Pacific Fleet. The submarine base, barely scratched by Japanese bombs, would soon dispatch underwater raiders that would strangle Japan's merchant marine and starve the home islands of raw materials. Most critically, the repair facilities and dry docks that could restore damaged battleships to fighting condition had escaped serious damage. Admiral Yamamoto's private reaction to the attack's success was notably subdued. While junior officers celebrated what appeared to be a perfect tactical victory, the combined fleet commander understood the strategic implications better than most. Japan had perhaps 18 months of oil reserves remaining after the American embargo. Every day that passed without decisive victory brought the empire closer to industrial collapse, and the attack on Pearl Harbor had guaranteed a long war with the world's most powerful industrial nation. The intelligence failure regarding American carrier locations was already generating recriminations within the Japanese high command. Despite months of careful surveillance by Takeo Yoshikawa, the three most valuable targets in the Pacific Fleet had escaped destruction through nothing more than routine scheduling. Enterprise was delivering fighters to Wake Island, Lexington was ferrying aircraft to Midway, and Saratoga remained in West Coast shipyards. These floating airfields represented a strategic threat that would only grow as American industrial capacity shifted to wartime production. The psychological dimension of the attack's aftermath was equally complex. Japanese pilots returning to their carriers reported high morale and confidence in ultimate victory, but careful observers noted signs of strain beneath the surface euphoria. Several airmen mentioned nightmares involving burning ships and men leaping into oil-slicked water. The clean, professional strike they had envisioned was proving messier and more traumatic than anticipated. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki's capture added another unwelcome dimension to Japanese concerns. The midget submarine commander had washed ashore unconscious on Oahu's coast after his vessel ran aground, becoming Japan's first prisoner of war. His capture had not been anticipated in operational planning, and the propaganda implications troubled officials who preferred to maintain the image of Japanese warriors who would die rather than surrender. The broader strategic picture was shifting in ways that few participants fully grasped. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor had been timed to coincide with simultaneous assaults on the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The southern resources area that contained the oil, rubber, and strategic materials essential for Japanese survival was under attack by forces that could now operate without fear of American naval intervention, at least temporarily. Think of how quickly triumph can transform into the seeds of ultimate defeat, how a perfect tactical victory can create the very conditions that ensure strategic catastrophe. But even as Japanese carriers steamed northward through the gathering darkness, carrying news of their victory back to an empire that had just committed itself to total war against a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity, the real battle for the Pacific was only beginning. The smell of burnt cordite still hung in Pearl Harbor's air when the first Japanese landing barges hit the beaches of Malaya, their timing synchronized to the minute with the attack that had just crippled American naval power 3,000 miles away. This coordination revealed the true scope of Japanese ambitions. Pearl Harbor was not an end in itself, but merely the opening move in a campaign designed to seize an empire stretching from the Aleutians to Australia. While American battleships settled into the mud of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces were simultaneously striking the Philippines, Hong Kong, Wake Island, and Guam. The southern resources area that contained the oil, rubber, and strategic materials essential for Japanese survival was under coordinated assault by forces that no longer feared American naval intervention. The psychological impact of this simultaneity was as devastating as the material damage. American commanders had prepared for war in the abstract, but the reality of coordinated attacks across half the Pacific Ocean revealed the inadequacy of their planning. The Philippines, supposedly defended by a combination of American regulars and Filipino scouts, found themselves facing veteran Japanese divisions supported by naval aviation that had just proven its effectiveness at Pearl Harbor. General Douglas MacArthur's Air Force in the Philippines suffered the same fate as their counterparts in Hawaii, caught on the ground despite hours of warning that war had begun. The carefully maintained formations of B-17 flying fortresses and P-40 fighters that were supposed to defend the islands were destroyed in neat rows, victims of the same peacetime security arrangements that had doomed aircraft at Wheeler and Hickam fields. The human dimension of this expanding catastrophe was becoming apparent in Japanese ready rooms as pilots prepared for their next missions. The euphoria of Pearl Harbor's success was tempered by the realization that they had committed Japan to a war of unprecedented scope and duration. Many airmen who had trained for years to fight a decisive battle against the American fleet now found themselves assigned to support amphibious landings against jungle airfields and colonial garrisons. The technical lessons of Pearl Harbor were already being incorporated into Japanese tactics. The modified Type 91 torpedoes had performed flawlessly in shallow water, validating months of engineering work and testing. But the armor-piercing bombs had proven less effective than hoped. Several had punched completely through their targets and exploded underwater, wasting their destructive potential. ordnance officers were already working on improved fusing mechanisms for future operations. The intelligence network that had made Pearl Harbor possible was expanding to support operations across the Pacific. Takeo Yoshikawa's success in Hawaii had demonstrated the value of long-term human intelligence gathering, and similar operations were being established throughout the region. Japanese consulates, trading companies, and fishing vessels all contributed to an intelligence picture that gave Japanese commanders unprecedented knowledge of Allied defenses and capabilities. Yet the most significant intelligence failure was already becoming apparent. Japanese planners had assumed that American morale would collapse after the loss of their battle fleet, leading to a negotiated peace that would leave Japan in control of its new conquests. Instead, radio intercepts and diplomatic reports suggested that American resolve was hardening into something far more dangerous than military despair. The industrial implications of prolonged warfare were beginning to concern thoughtful Japanese officers. America's production capacity dwarfed Japan's by a factor of 10 to 1 in critical areas like steel production and shipbuilding. Every month that passed would see this disparity grow larger as American factories converted from civilian to military production. The window of opportunity purchased by Pearl Harbor's success was already beginning to close. Admiral Yamamoto's private correspondence during this period revealed his growing pessimism about Japan's long-term prospects. The combined fleet commander had pushed for the Pearl Harbor attack precisely because he understood that Japan could not win a protracted war against American industrial capacity. The attack was supposed to buy time for a negotiated settlement, but American reaction suggested that negotiation was the last thing on Washington's mind. The religious and cultural dimensions of the expanding conflict were also becoming apparent. State Shinto ceremonies had blessed the departing fleet, and many pilots carried omamori charms from family shrines tucked into their flight jacket pockets. Yet, the scale of destruction at Pearl Harbor troubled some participants who had envisioned a clean, professional military operation rather than the carnage they had witnessed. The diplomatic aftermath of Pearl Harbor continued to complicate Japanese strategy. The delayed delivery of the 14-part message had made the attack appear treacherous, even by the standards of total war, galvanizing American public opinion in ways that Japanese planners had not anticipated. What was supposed to be a limited war for control of Southeast Asian resources was transforming into an ideological struggle that would admit no compromise. The submarine dimension of the conflict was already proving more significant than either side had anticipated. American submarines based at Pearl Harbor had escaped destruction and were being dispatched to attack Japanese shipping lanes throughout the Pacific. The very submarine base that Japanese planners had ignored during their attack would soon become the headquarters for a campaign that would strangle Japan's merchant marine and starve the home islands of essential supplies. Can you imagine the weight of realizing that your greatest tactical victory might have set in motion the forces that would ensure your ultimate strategic defeat? The irony was becoming apparent even to participants at the time. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor had been designed to prevent American interference in the conquest of Southeast Asia, but it had instead guaranteed American entry into a global war that would ultimately consume the Japanese empire itself. The sun glinted off the waters of Tokyo Bay as Admiral Yamamoto stood on Nagato's bridge, reading casualty reports that transformed tactical triumph into strategic uncertainty. 29 aircraft lost, 64 airmen dead, and 1 submarine officer captured alive in a war that was supposed to end before it truly began. The human cost of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the raw numbers tallied in official reports. In hospital wards across Oahu, American sailors fought for their lives with burns covering 60% of their bodies, their flesh seared by flaming oil that had turned Pearl Harbor into a maritime inferno. Meanwhile, in Japanese naval hospitals, pilots who had returned as heroes struggled with nightmares that no victory celebration could banish. Images of men leaping from burning ships into water that offered no sanctuary from the flames. Heinrich Sevelo's German counterparts in the Imperial Navy were discovering that triumph and trauma could coexist in the same mind. Several Japanese pilots reported recurring dreams about specific moments during the attack. Not the successful torpedo strikes or the spectacular magazine explosion that destroyed Arizona, but individual faces glimpsed through their gun sights. American sailors who had looked up at the wrong moment and made eye contact with death approaching at 200 knots. The strategic arithmetic that had driven Japan to war remained unchanged by Pearl Harbor's success. The oil embargo that had precipitated the crisis continued to drain Japanese reserves at the rate of 12,000 tons per day. Every barrel burned by Kido Butai during its return voyage brought the empire one step closer to industrial paralysis. The southern resources area that contained salvation lay defended by forces that were now fully alerted and increasingly desperate. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki's capture had created an entirely new category of problem for Japanese strategists. His interrogation was revealing details about midget submarine capabilities and tactics that American intelligence had never suspected. More troubling was the propaganda value of his survival. Here was living proof that Japanese warriors could be taken alive, contradicting years of indoctrination about death before dishonor. The diplomatic reverberations of Pearl Harbor were spreading far beyond the immediate combatants. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later write that he went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful upon learning of the attack, knowing that American entry into the war guaranteed ultimate Allied victory. The Japanese strike that was supposed to isolate America from the global conflict had instead made that conflict truly global and decisive. Technical analysis of the attack was revealing both successes and failures that would shape future operations. The shallow-water torpedo modifications had worked flawlessly, but the armor-piercing bombs had proven inconsistent. Too many had over-penetrated their targets and exploded harmlessly underwater. More critically, the decision to ignore infrastructure targets like fuel farms and repair facilities was already enabling American recovery at a pace that Japanese planners had deemed impossible. Within 6 months, most of the battleships damaged at Pearl Harbor would be back in service, their wounds healed by the very repair facilities that Nagumo had chosen not to attack. The submarine base that had escaped destruction would launch underwater raiders that would sink more Japanese tonnage than all other causes combined. The fuel farms that had been left untouched would power the fleet that would carry the war to Japan's doorstep. The industrial mobilization that Pearl Harbor triggered in the United States was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Automobile factories were retooling to build aircraft engines, shipyards were expanding to accommodate construction programs that defied belief, and research laboratories were pursuing technologies that would revolutionize warfare itself. The sleeping giant was not merely awakening, it was transforming into something unprecedented in human history. Admiral Yamamoto's assessment of Japan's prospects remained grimly realistic. The combined fleet commander had warned before the attack that Japan might run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence in victory. Pearl Harbor had bought time, but it had also guaranteed that the war would continue until one side or the other faced complete industrial and military collapse. The cultural dimensions of the expanding conflict were becoming apparent in ways that neither side had fully anticipated. American propaganda was already transforming Pearl Harbor into a symbol of treachery that would sustain public morale through 4 years of bitter fighting. Japanese propaganda celebrated the attack as proof of spiritual superiority over material wealth, but privately, many officers wondered whether spirit alone would prove sufficient against American industrial capacity. The prisoners taken at Pearl Harbor, most of them Japanese submariners who had survived the sinking of their midget submarines, were providing American intelligence with insights into Japanese capabilities and intentions that would prove invaluable in future engagements. The very success of the attack had created intelligence opportunities that Japanese planners had never considered. Think of how victory can contain the seeds of its own destruction, how achieving your immediate objectives can set in motion forces that will ultimately consume everything you sought to protect. The war that began at Pearl Harbor would indeed run for 44 more months, consuming the Pacific in flames that would make the burning harbor look like a small campfire. The tactical masterpiece that was December 7th, 1941, had purchased Japan exactly what Yamamoto predicted: 6 months to run wild before the full weight of American industrial might fell upon the rising sun like a hammer blow that would reshape the entire Pacific world. The last Japanese aircraft had recovered aboard their carriers by mid-morning on December 7th, but the war they had started would not end until mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio waves to announce surrender in terms that would have been unthinkable on that Sunday morning when the world changed forever.